This is the fascinating life history of Kenya's first president, Jomo Kenyatta. As a member of the Kikuyu people, Jomo Kenyatta was born Kamau wa Muigai in the small rural village of Ngenda. Birth records were not kept among the Kikuyu community then, and Jomo Kenyatta's date of birth is not exactly known. One biographer known as Jules Archer suggested that Kenyatta was born in 1890 or 1891, although a fuller analysis by another historian known as Jeremy Murray Brown suggested Kenyatta's birth to be between 1897 and 1898. Jomo Kenyatta's father was a man named Muigai and his mother was Wambui. They lived in a homestead near River Terereka where they cultivated crops and bred sheep and goats. Muigai was sufficiently wealthy that he could afford to keep several wives, each wife living in a separate nyumba, Kikuyu word for hut. Jomo Kenyatta was raised according to traditional Kikuyu customs and belief, and he was taught the skills needed to herd the family flock. When he was 10 years old, his earlobes were pierced to mark his transition from childhood to pubescent. Wambui, Kenyatta's mother, subsequently bore another son known as Kongo, who was born shortly before Muigai died. In keeping with Kikuyu tradition, Wambui, Kenyatta's mother, then married her late husband's younger brother, Ngengi. Kenyatta then took the name of Kamau wa Ngengi as his name. Wambui went on to birth a son for her new husband, whom they also named Muigai after Kenyatta's biological father. Ngengi was harsh and resentful towards the three boys, and Wambui decided to take her youngest son to live with her parents in present-day Kikuyu near the site of the Dogoto Mission School. It was there that she died, and Jomo Kenyatta, who was very fond of his younger brother Muigai, traveled to collect the infant half-brother and stay with him. Kenyatta then moved in with his grandfather, who was known as Kongo Wamagana, and assisted the latter in his role as a traditional healer. In November 1909, Jomo Kenyatta left home and enrolled as a pupil at the Church of Scotland Mission (CSM) at Dogoto. The missionaries were zealous Christians who believed that bringing Christianity to the indigenous people of East Africa was part of Britain's civilization mission. While learning there, Kenyatta stayed at the small boarding school where he learned stories from the Bible and was taught to read and write in English. He also performed chores for the mission, including washing the dishes and weeding the gardens. He was soon joined at the mission dormitory by his brother Kongo. The longer the pupils stayed, the more they came to resent the patronizing way that many of the British missionaries were treating them. Jomo Kenyatta's academic progress was unremarkable at best, and in July 1912, he became the apprentice to the mission's carpenter. That year, he professed his dedication to Christianity as a religion, and he began undergoing catechism. In 1913, he underwent the Kikuyu circumcision ritual, although the missionaries generally disapproved of the custom, but it was an important aspect of the Kikuyu tradition that Kenyatta respected, so he sneaked out of school to go and get circumcised. When he was asked to take a Christian name for his upcoming baptism, Kenyatta first chose John and Peter after Jesus' apostles, but when the missionaries forced him to choose just one name, he chose Johnston, the stone chosen as reference to Peter, the rock of the church. Accordingly, Kenyatta was baptized as Johnston Kamau in August 1914. After his baptism, Jomo Kenyatta moved out of the mission dormitory and lived with friends. Having completed his apprenticeship to the carpenter, Jomo Kenyatta requested that the mission allow him to be an apprentice stonemason, but they refused. He then requested that the mission recommended him for employment, but the head missionary refused because of multiple allegations of minor dishonesty from Kenyatta. Jomo Kenyatta moved to Thika starting 1914, where he worked for an engineering firm run by a Briton man called John Cook. In this position, he was tasked with fetching the company wages from a bank in Nairobi, which was 40 kilometers away. Kenyatta left the job when he became seriously ill, and he went to recuperate at a friend's house in the Tumutumu Presbyterian Mission. At the time, the British Empire was engaged in the First World War, and the British Army had forcefully recruited many Kikuyu men. One of those who joined was Kongo, Kenyatta's brother, who disappeared during the conflict, and his family would never hear of him again. Jomo Kenyatta did not join the armed forces, and like other Kikuyus, he moved to live among the Maasai, who had refused to fight for the British. Kenyatta then lived with the family of an aunt who had married a Maasai chief. Adopting Maasai customs and wearing Maasai jewelry, including beaded belt known as a Kenyatta in the Kikuyu language, which would end up giving him his famous name Kenyatta. At some point, he took to calling himself Kenyatta from people referring to him after that belt. In 1917, Jomo Kenyatta moved to Narok to evade being drafted into British colonial forces fighting in World War I, where he was involved in transporting livestock to Nairobi from Narok. Later, he would relocate to Nairobi to work in a store selling farming and engineering equipment. In the evenings, Kenyatta took classes in a church mission school. Several months later, he returned to Thika before he got employment building houses for the Thogoto mission. He also lived for a short time in Dagoretti, where he became a retainer for local sub-chief Kioi, and in 1919, he would assist Kioi, the sub-chief, in putting his case in a land dispute before the Nairobi court because Kenyatta could speak both Swahili and English. When he desired a wife, Jomo Kenyatta entered a relationship with a girl known as Grace Wahu, who had attended the CMA school in Kabete, and in their relationship, she initially moved into Kenyatta's family homestead, although she would later join Kenyatta in Dagoretti when Gengi drove her out. On 20th November 1920, Grace Wahu gave birth to Kenyatta's son, Peter Moigai. In October 1920, Kenyatta was called before the Thogoto CAG session and suspended from taking Holy Communion. The suspension was in response to his drinking and his relations with Wahu out of wedlock. The church insisted that a traditional Kikuyu wedding would be inadequate and that he must undergo a Christian marriage. This took place on 8th November 1922. Kenyatta had initially refused to cease drinking, but in July 1923, he officially renounced alcohol and was allowed to return to Holy Communion. In April 1922, Jomo Kenyatta began working as a stores clerk and meter reader for Cook, who had been appointed water superintendent for Nairobi Municipal Council. Kenyatta earned 250 shillings, money that he was paid every month, which was a particularly high wage for a native African back then, and the money brought him financial independence and a growing sense of self-confidence. Jomo Kenyatta lived in the Kilimani neighborhood of Nairobi, although he financed the construction of a second home at Dagoretti, and once his house in Dagoretti was built, he was known for referring to it as the Kenyatta stores because he used to hold general provisions for the neighborhood from this house. At this point, Kenyatta had sufficient funds that he could lend money to European clerks in the offices, and he could enjoy the lifestyle offered by Nairobi City, which included cinemas, football matches, and imported British fashions. Anti-British and anti-colonialist sentiment was on the rise amongst both native and Indian communities in Kenya following the Irish War of Independence and the Russian October Revolution, both happening in 1922. Many indigenous Africans resented having to carry Kipande identity certificates all the time, being forbidden from growing coffee and paying taxes without political representation, among other things. Political upheavals occurred in Kikuyu land, the area inhabited largely by the Kikuyu people, following World War I, among them the campaigns led by men like Harituku and the East African Association, resulting in the government massacre of 21 native people who were protesting in March 1922. Jomo Kenyatta had not yet taken part in these events, perhaps because he feared that he would disrupt his lucrative employment prospects working for the city council. Kenyatta's interest in politics stemmed from his friendship with James Buta, a senior figure in the Kikuyu Central Association KCA. Buta took Kenyatta to a political meeting in Pumwani, Nairobi, although this led to no firm involvement of Kenyatta in politics at the time. In either 1925 or early 1926, James Buta moved to Uganda but remained in contact with Jomo Kenyatta. When the Kikuyu Central Association wrote a letter to Buta asking him to travel to London as their representative, he declined, but recommended that Jomo Kenyatta, who had a good command of English, go in his place. Kenyatta accepted, probably on the condition that the KCA Association matched or paid him an equal of his pre-existing pay from the Nairobi County Council. After accepting, Kenyatta therefore became the group secretary general. It is likely that the Kikuyu Central Association KCA purchased a motorbike for Kenyatta, which he would then use to travel around Kikuyu land and neighboring areas inhabited by the communities of Meru and Embu, helping to establish new KCA branches among these people. In February 1928, Kenyatta was part of the KCA party that visited Government House in Nairobi to give evidence in front of the Hilton Young Commission, which was then considered a federation between Kenya, Uganda and Tanganyika, as part of their case agitating for the return of their land. In June, Kenyatta was part of a KCA team which appeared before a select committee of the Kenyan Legislative Council to express concerns about the recent introduction of land boards introduced by the British Governor of Kenya, Edward Grieg, under the directive that the land boards would hold all land in native reserves in trust for each tribal group, including the Kikuyu, Embu and Meru. Both the KCA and the Kikuyu Association opposed these land boards, which treated Kikuyu land as collectively owned rather than recognizing individual Kikuyu land ownership. Also in February, Kenyatta's daughter Wambui Margaret was born in that year of 1928. By this point, he was increasingly using the name Kenyatta, which had a more African appearance than Johnson. In May 1928, the KCA launched a Kikuyu language magazine known as Moikuithania, roughly translated as The Reconciler, in which it published news, articles and homilies. Its purpose was to help unify the Kikuyu and raise funds for the Kikuyu Central Association. Kenyatta was listed as the publication's editor, although Mary Brown suggested that he was not the guiding hand behind it and that his duties were largely confined to translating into Kikuyu. It is only Jomo Kenyatta who would later emerge as the de facto leader of this publication in the coming years. Aware that Harry Thuku had been exiled for his activism to Somalia, Jomo Kenyatta took a cautious approach to campaigning, and in the magazine Moikuithania, he expressed support for the judges, district commissioners and chiefs. He also praised the British Empire, stating that the first thing about the empire is that all people are governed justly, big or small, equally. The second thing is that nobody is regarded as a slave, everyone is free. These writings in favor of the British, however, did not prevent Governor Grigg from writing to the authorities in London requesting them permission to shut down the magazine operated by Jomo Kenyatta. After the KCA raised sufficient funds, in February 1929, Jomo Kenyatta sailed from Mombasa to Britain. Colonial Governor Grigg's administration could not stop Kenyatta's journey, but they asked London's colonial office not to meet Kenyatta when he arrived. He initially stayed at the West African Student Association premises in Western London, where he met Ladipo Solanke. He then is said to have lodged with a prostitute. Both this and Kenyatta's lavish spending ending up bringing concern from the Church Mission Society, and his landlord subsequently impounded his belongings due to unpaid debt of rent. In the city of London, Kenyatta met with W. MacGregor Ross at the Royal Empire Society, and Ross briefed him on how to deal with the colonial office concerning his matters that had brought him to Britain. Kenyatta became friends with Ross's family and accompanied them to social events in Hampstead. He also contacted some anti-imperialists that were active in Britain, including the League Against Imperialism, Fenner Brockway and Kingsley Martin. Kenya's colonial governor Edward Grigg was in London at the same time, and despite his opposition to Kenyatta's visit, finally agreed to meet Kenyatta at the Rhodes Trust headquarters in April. At the meeting, Kenyatta raised the land issue and Thuku's exile, the atmosphere between the two being friendly. In spite of this, following the meeting, Grigg convinced Special Branch to monitor Kenyatta and his activities in London. Kenyatta developed contacts with radicals to the left of the Labour Party in Britain, including several communists, in the summer of 1929, and he left London and travelled by Berlin to Moscow before returning to London in October. Kenyatta was strongly influenced by his time in the Soviet Union, especially from his readings and interactions with Soviet leaders. Back in England, he wrote 3 articles on the Kenyan situation for the Communist Party of Great Britain's newspapers, The Daily Worker and Sunday Worker, and in this, his criticism of British imperialism was far stronger than it had been in Moikuithania back home. These communist links concerned many of Kenyatta's liberal patrons. In January, Kenyatta met with Drummond Shields, the Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, at the House of Commons. Jomo Kenyatta told Shields that he was not affiliated with communist circles and he was unaware of the nature of the newspaper which published his articles. Shields advised Kenyatta to return home to promote Kikuyu involvement in the constitutional process and discourage violence and extremism amongst his people against colonialists. After 18 months in Europe, Jomo Kenyatta had run out of money to continue staying in London. The Anti-Slavery Society advanced him funds to pay off his debts and return to Kenya. Although Kenyatta enjoyed life in London and feared arrests if returned to Nairobi, he ended up sailing back to Mombasa in September 1930. On his return, his prestige among the Kikuyu was high because of his time spent in Europe and the writings he had been writing and sending home. In his absence, female genital mutilation had become a topic of strong debate in Kikuyu society. The Protestant churches, backed by European medics and the colonial authorities, supported the abolition of this traditional practice, but the KCA rallied to its defense, claiming that its abolition would damage the structure of Kikuyu society. Anger between the two sides had heightened. Several churches expelled KCA members from their congregation, and it was believed that the January 1930 killings of an American missionary, Holder Stump, had been due to this issue. As secretary of the KCA, Kenyatta met with the church representatives. He expressed the view that although personally opposing FGM, he himself regarded its legal abolition as counterproductive and argued that the churches should focus on eradicating the practice through educating the people about its harmful effects on women's health. The meeting ended without compromise, and John Arthur, the head of the Church of Scotland in Kenya, later expelled Kenyatta from the church, citing that he deemed dishonesty during the debate. In 1931, Jomo Kenyatta took his son out of the church school at Thogota and enrolled him in a KCA-approved independent school. In May 1931, Jomo Kenyatta and Parmenas Kitendo Mokri set sail on a ship from Mombasa to Britain, intended on representing the KCA at a joint committee of parliament on the future of East Africa in London. Kenyatta would not return to Kenya for 15 years after this travel. In Britain, he spent the summer attending an independent Labour Party summer school and Fabia Society gatherings. In June, he visited Geneva, Switzerland and attended a Save the Children conference on African children. In November, Kenyatta met the Indian independence leader Mohandas Gandhi while in London. That month, he enrolled at Woodbrook Quaker College in Birmingham, where he remained until the spring of 1932, attaining a certificate in English writing. In Britain, Kenyatta befriended an Afro-Caribbean Marxist, George Padmore, who was working for the Soviet-run Comintern. Over time, he became Padmore's protege. In late 1932, Kenyatta joined Padmore in Germany. Before the end of the year, the duo relocated to Moscow, where Kenyatta studied at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. There, he was taught arithmetic, geography, natural science, and political economy, as well as Marxist-Leninist doctrine and the history of the Marxist-Leninist movement. Many Africans and members of the African diaspora were attracted to the institution because it offered free education and the opportunity to study in an environment free from the institutionalized racism present in the US and British Empire. Kenyatta complained about the food, accommodation, and poor quality of English instruction. There is no evidence that he joined the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and one of his fellow students later characterized Kenyatta as the biggest reactionary I've ever met. Kenyatta also visited Siberia, probably as part of an official guided tour. The emergence of Germany's Nazi government shifted political allegiances in Europe. The Soviet Union pursued formal alliances with France and Czechoslovakia, and thus reduced its support for the movement against British and French colonial rule in Africa. As a result, Comintern disbanded the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, with which both Padmore and Jomo Kenyatta were affiliated. Padmore resigned from the Soviet Communist Party in protest and was subsequently vilified in the Soviet press. Both Padmore and Jomo Kenyatta left the Soviet Union, the latter returning to London in August 1933. The British authorities were highly suspicious of Kenyatta's time in the Soviet Union, suspecting that he was a Marxist-Leninist, and following his return, the MI5 intelligence service intercepted and read all his mail. Jomo Kenyatta continued writing articles reflecting Padmore's influence. Between 1931 and 1937, he wrote several articles for the Negro Worker and joined the newspaper's editorial board in 1933. He also produced an article for a November 1933 issue of Labour Monthly, and in May 1934, he had a letter published in the Manchester Guardian. He also wrote the entry on Kenya for the Negro magazine, an anthology edited by Nancy Cunard and published in 1934. In this, Kenyatta took a more radical position than he had in the past, calling for a complete self-rule in Kenya. In doing so, he was virtually alone among political Kenyans, figures like Thoko and Jesse Kariuki, who were far more moderate in their demands. The pro-independence statements that he was able to express in Britain would not have been permitted in Kenya itself. Between 1935 and 1937, Kenyatta worked as a linguistic informant for the phonetics department at University College London UCL. His Kikuyu voice recordings assisted Lilias Armstrong's production of the phonetic and tonal structure of Kikuyu. The book was published under Armstrong's name, although Kenyatta claimed he should have been listed as co-author. Kenyatta enrolled at UCL as a student, studying an English course between January and July 1935, and then a phonetics course from October 1935 to June 1936. Enabled by a grant from the International African Institute, he also took a social anthropology course under Bonslow Malinowski at the London School of Economics, LSE. Jomo Kenyatta lacked the qualification normally required to join the course, but Professor Malinowski was keen to support the participation of indigenous peoples in anthropological research. For Kenyatta, acquiring an advanced degree would bolster his status among Kenyans and display his intellectual equality with white Europeans in Kenya. Over the course of his studies, Jomo Kenyatta and Malinowski became close friends. Kenyatta's fellow classmates during the time included the anthropologists Audrey Richards, Lucy Mayer, and Esfed Huxley. Another of his fellow LSE students was Prince Peter of Greece and Denmark, who invited Kenyatta to stay with him and his mother, Princess Marie Bonaparte, in Paris during the spring of 1936. Kenyatta returned to his former dwellings at 95 Cambridge Street in London, where he had stayed before traveling to Russia, but he did not not pay his landlady for over a year, owing more than 100 sterling pounds. This angered Mr. Ross and contributed to the breakdown of his friendship with Jomo Kenyatta. Kenyatta then rented a Camden Town flat with his friend Dinah Stock, whom he had met in an anti-imperialist rally in Trafalgar Square. Kenyatta socialized at the Student Movement House in Russell Square, which he had joined in spring of 1934, and befriended Africans in the city. To earn money, he worked as one of the 250 black extras in the film Sandals of the River, filmed at Shepperton Studios in autumn of 1934. Several other Africans in London criticized him for doing so, arguing that the film degraded black people. Appearing in the film also allowed him to meet and befriend its star, the African-American Paul Robeson. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia, prompting Kenyatta and other African leaders in London to rise in protest, and Kenyatta became the honorary secretary of the International African Friends of Abyssinia, a group established by Padmore and a man known as CLR James to lobby against Rome's invasion of Ethiopia. When Ethiopia's monarch Haile Selassie fled to London in exile, Jomo Kenyatta personally welcomed him at Waterloo Station. This group developed into a wider Pan-Africanist organization, the International African Service Bureau (IASB), of which Kenyatta became one of the vice chairs. Jomo Kenyatta began giving anti-colonialist lectures across Britain through various groups such as IASB, the Workers' Education Association, Indian National Congress of Great Britain, and the League of Coloured Peoples. In October 1938, Kenyatta gave a talk to the Manchester Fabian Society in which he described Britain colonial policy as fascism and compared the treatment of indigenous peoples in East Africa to the treatment of Jews in Nazi Germany. In response to these activities, the British Colonial Office reopened their file on him, although could not find any evidence that he was engaged in anything sufficiently seditious to warrant prosecution. Kenyatta then assembled the essays on Kikuyu society written for Malinowski's class and published them as Facing Mount Kenya in 1938. Featuring an introduction written by Professor Malinowski, the book reflected Kenyatta's desire to use anthropology as a weapon against colonialism. In it, Kenyatta challenged the Eurocentric view of history by presenting an image of a golden African past by emphasizing the perceived order, virtue, and self-sufficiency of Kikuyu society. Utilizing a functionalist framework, Kenyatta promoted the idea that traditional Kikuyu society had a cohesion and integrity that was better than anything offered by European colonialism. In this book, Kenyatta made clear his belief that the rights of the individual should be downgraded in favor of the interests of the group. The book also reflected his changing views on female genital mutilation, where once he opposed it, he now unequivocally supported the practice, downplaying the medical dangers that it posed to women. The book's jacket cover featured an image of Kenyatta in traditional dress, wearing a skin cloak over one shoulder and carrying a spear. The book was published under the name Jomo Kenyatta, the first time he had done so, and the term Jomo was close to a Kikuyu word describing the removal of a sword from its scabbard. Facing Mount Kenya was a commercial failure, selling only 517 copies, but was generally well received. An exception was among white Kenyans, whose assumption about the Kikuyu being primitive savages in need of European civilization was challenged deeply by the writings of the book by Kenyatta. Jeremy Murray Brown, the historian, later described it as a propaganda tour de force, claiming that no other African had made such an uncompromising stand for tribal integrity. A scholar known as Body Folk Fredrickson later referred to Kenyatta's book as probably the most well-known and influential African scholarly work of its time. After the United Kingdom entered World War II in September 1939, Kenyatta and his female roommate Dinah Stock decided to move to the Sussex village of Storrington. Kenyatta would remain there for the duration of the war, renting a flat and a small plot of land to grow vegetables and raise chickens. He settled into rural Sussex life and became a regular at the village pub, where he gained the nickname Jumbo. In August 1940, he took a job at a local farm as an agricultural worker, allowing him to evade military conscription before working in the tomato greenhouses at Linfield. He attempted to join the local home guard but was turned down. On 11th May 1942, he married an English woman, Edna Grace Clark, at Chanctonbury Registry Office. In August 1943, the following year, their son, Peter Magana, was born. British intelligence services continued monitoring Kenyatta, noting that he was politically inactive between 1939 and 1944, the period of the war. In Sussex, he wrote an essay for the United Society for Christian Literature titled My People of Kikuyu and the Life of Chief Wangombe, in which he called for his tribal political independence. He also began, although never finished, a novel partly based on his life experiences. He continued to give lectures around the country, including to groups of East African soldiers stationed in Britain. He became frustrated by the distance between him and Kenya, telling Edna that he felt like a general separated by 5,000 miles from his troops. While he was absent, Kenya's colonial authorities banned the KCA in 1940. Kenyatta and other senior IASB members began planning for the 5th African Congress held in Manchester in October 1945. They were assisted by Kwame Nkrumah, a Gold Coast Ghanaian who arrived in Britain earlier that year. Kenyatta spoke at the conference, although he made no particular impact on the proceedings. Much of the debate that took place centered on whether indigenous Africans should continue pursuing a gradual campaign for independence or whether they should seek the military overthrow of the European imperialists. The conference ended with a statement declaring that while delegates desired a peaceful transition to African self-rule, Africans, as a last resort, may have to appeal to force in the effort to achieve freedom. Jomo Kenyatta supported this resolution, although at the time was more cautious than other delegates and made no open commitment to violence. He subsequently authored an IASB pamphlet known as Kenya, the Land of Conflict, in which he blended political calls for independence with romanticized descriptions of an idealized pre-colonial African past. After British victory in the World War II, Kenyatta received a request to return to Kenya in September 1946, sailing back that same month. He decided not to bring Edna, who was pregnant with a second child, aware that if his British family joined him in Kenya, their lives would be made instantly difficult by colonial racial laws on marriage. On his arrival in Mombasa, Kenyatta was greeted by his first wife, Grace Wahu, and their children. He built a bungalow at Gatondo, near to where he was born, and began farming his 32-acre estate. Kenyatta met with the new governor of Kenya, Philip Ewan Mitchell, and in March 1947 accepted a post to an African Land Settlement Board, holding the post for 2 years. He also met with Mbio Koinange to discuss the future of the Koinange Independent Teachers College in Githongori. There, Koinange appointed Kenyatta as the school's first vice principal. In May 1947, Koinange moved to England, leaving Jomo Kenyatta to take full control of the college. Under Kenyatta's leadership, additional funds were raised for the construction of school buildings, and the number of boys in attendance rose from 250 to 900 children. It was also beset with problems, including a decline in standards and teacher strikes over non-payment of wages, all during Kenyatta's leadership. Gradually, the number of enrolled pupils fell. Meanwhile, Jomo Kenyatta built a friendship with Koinange's father, a senior chief, who gave Kenyatta one of his daughters to take as a wife during the period after his return from Britain. They had a child, Jenny McKenna, but Kenyatta's bride, McKenna's mother, died at childbirth. In 1951, Kenyatta married his fourth wife, Ngina, who was one of the few female students at his college, and she gave birth to a daughter. The daughter was Christina Wambui Pratt. In August 1944, the Kenya African Union, KAU, had been founded, and at the time it was the only active political outlet for indigenous Africans in the colony. At its June 1947 annual general meeting, KAU's president, James Gishuru, stepped down and Kenyatta was elected as his replacement. Kenyatta began to draw large crowds wherever he traveled in Kikuyu land, and Kikuyu press began describing him as the savior, great elder, and hero of our race. He was nevertheless aware that to achieve independence, KAU needed the support of other indigenous tribes and ethnic groups in Kenya. This was made difficult by the fact that many Maasai and Luo, tribes that were traditionally hostile to the Kikuyu, regarded him as an advocate of Kikuyu dominance in Kenya. He therefore insisted on intertribal representation on the KAU executive and ensured that the party business was conducted in Swahili, the lingua franca of the indigenous Kenyans, as opposed to Kikuyu, which many Luo, Maasai, and other tribes did not understand. To attract support from Kenya's Indian community, Kenyatta made contact with Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of the new Indian Republic. Nehru's response was supportive, sending a message to Kenya's Indian minority, reminding them that they were the guests of the indigenous African population. Relations with the white minority remained strained because for most white Kenyans, Kenyatta was their principal enemy, an agitator with links to the Soviet Union who had the impertinence to marry a white woman. They too increasingly called for further Kenyan autonomy from the British government, but they wanted continued white minority rule and closer links to the white minority governments of South Africa, Northern Rhodesia, and Southern Rhodesia, and they viewed Britain's newly elected Labour government with great suspicion. The White Electors Union put forward a Kenya plan which proposed greater white settlement in Kenya, bringing Tanganyika into the British Empire and incorporating it within their new British East African Dominion. In April 1950, Jomo Kenyatta was present at a joint meeting of KAU and the East African Indian National Congress, in which they both expressed opposition to the Kenyan plan as it was put forward by the white minority. By 1952, Jomo Kenyatta was widely recognized as a national leader both by his supporters and by his opponents. As KAU leader, he was at pains to oppose all illegal activity, including workers' strikes. He called on his supporters to work hard and to abandon laziness, theft, and crime. He also insisted that in an independent Kenya, all racial groups would be safeguarded. Kenyatta's gradualist and peaceful approach to politics contrasted with the growth of the Mauma were praising, as armed guerrilla groups began targeting the white minority and members of the Kikuyu community who did not support them. By 1959, the Mau Mau had killed around 1,880 people. For many young Mau Mau militants, Kenyatta was regarded as a hero, and they often included his name in the oaths they gave to the organization members. Such oathing was a Kikuyu custom by which individuals pledged allegiance to the tribe and the collective Kikuyu fight against colonial occupation. Kenyatta himself publicly distanced himself from the Mau Mau. In April 1952, he began a speaking tour in which he denounced the Mau Mau to assembled crowds, insisting that independence must be achieved through peaceful means. In August, he attended a much-publicized mass meeting in Kiambu, where, in front of 30,000 people, Kenyatta said that Mau Mau had spoiled the country. He said, "Let the Mau Mau perish forever. All people should search for Mau Mau and kill it." End of quote. Despite Kenyatta's vocal opposition to the Mau Mau, KAU had moved towards a position of greater militancy. At its 1951 annual general meeting, more militant African nationalists had taken senior positions, and the party officially announced its call for Kenyan independence within 3 years. In January 1952, Kenya African Union members formed a secret central committee devoted to direct action, formulated along a cell structure similar to the Mau Mau. Whatever Kenyatta's views on these developments, he had a little ability to control them. He was increasingly frustrated. In October 1952, Jomo Kenyatta was arrested and driven to Nairobi, where he was taken aboard a plane and flown to Town, northwest Kenya, one of the most remote locations in the country. From there, he wrote to his family to let them know of his situation. Kenya's colonial authorities at the time believed that detaining Kenyatta would help quell civil unrest. Many white settlers wanted him exiled, but the government feared this would turn him into a martyr for the anti-colonialist cause. They thought it better that he would be convicted and imprisoned, although at the time had nothing to charge him with, and so began searching his personal files for evidence of criminal activity. Eventually, they charged him and 5 other senior KAU members with masterminding the Mau Mau, a proscribed group. The historian John M. Lonsdale stated that Kenyatta had been made a scapegoat, while another historian known as A.B. Asenso later suggested that the authorities knew very well that Kenyatta was not involved in the Mau Mau, but they were nevertheless committed to silencing his cause for independence. The trial took place in Kapenguria, a remote area near the Ugandan border that the authorities hoped would not attract crowd or attention. Together, Jomo Kenyatta, Bildad Kagia, Fred Kubai, Paul Ngei, Achieng' Oneko, Kongo Karumba, all of them the Kapenguria 6, were put on trial. The defendants assembled an international and multiracial team of defense lawyers, including Chamam Law, H.O. Davis, F.R.S. D'Souza, and Dudley Thompson, led by British barrister and Member of Parliament Dennis Noel Pritt. Pritt's involvement brought much media attention. During the trial, he faced government harassment and was sent death threats. The judge who was selected to oversee the case, known as Ransley Thaka, had recently retired from the Supreme Court of Kenya, and the colonial government knew he would be sympathetic to their case and gave him £20,000 to oversee it. The trial lasted 5 months, and Rawson Macharia, the main prosecution witness, turned out to have perjured himself. The judge had only recently been awarded an unusually large pension and maintained secret contact with the then colonial governor Evan Baring. The prosecution failed to produce any strong evidence that Jomo Kenyatta or the others had any involvement in managing the Mau Mau movement. In April 1953, Judge Thaka found the defendants guilty. He sentenced them to 7 years hard labor to be followed by indefinite restriction preventing them from leaving a given area without permission. In addressing the court, Kenyatta stated that he and others did not recognize the judge's findings. They claimed that the government had used them as scapegoats as a pretext to shut down KAU. The historian Wanyubari O. Maloba later characterized it as a rigged political trial with a predetermined outcome. The government followed the verdict with a wider crackdown, banning KAU in June 1953, closing down most of the independent schools in the country, including Jomo Kenyatta's own school in Githunguri. The colonialists also appropriated his land at Katondo and demolished his house. Jomo Kenyatta and others were returned to Town, where they resided on remand while awaiting the results of the appeal process. Pritt pointed out that Thaka had been appointed magistrate for the wrong district, a technicality voiding the whole trial. The Supreme Court of Kenya agreed, and Kenyatta and the others were freed in July 1953, only to be immediately rearrested. The government took the case to the East African Court of Appeal, which reversed the Supreme Court's decision in August of that year of 1953. The appeals process resumed in October 1953, and in January 1954, the Supreme Court upheld the convictions against all but Achieng' Oneko. Pritt finally took the case to the Privy Council in London. However, they refused his petition without providing any explanation. He later noted that this was despite the fact that his case was one of the strongest he had ever presented during his career. According to Jeremy Murray Brown, it is likely that political rather than legal considerations informed their decisions to reject the case. During the appeal process, a prison had been built in Rocky Town where Jomo Kenyatta and others were then imprisoned. The others were made to break rocks in the hot sun, but Jomo Kenyatta, because of his age, was instead appointed their cook, preparing a daily diet of beans and posho. In 1955, a man known as P. de Roebuck became the district officer, after which Kenyatta and the other inmates were treated more leniently. In April 1954, they had been joined by a captured Mau Mau commander known as Waroyo Itote, and Kenyatta befriended him and gave him English lessons. By 1957, the inmates in the Kapenguria 6th group and formed into two rival groups, with Kenyatta and Itote on one side and the other KAU members now calling themselves the National Democratic Party on the other side. In one incident, one of his rivals made an unsuccessful attempt to stab Jomo Kenyatta at breakfast. Kenyatta's health had deteriorated in prison because chains and manacles had caused problems for his feet and he had eczema across his body. Kenyatta's imprisonment transformed him into a political martyr for many Kenyans, further enhancing his status. A Luo anti-colonialist activist known as Jaramogi Oginga Odinga was the first to publicly call for Kenyatta's release, an issue that gained growing support among Kenya's anti-colonialists. In 1955, the British writer Montagu Slater, a socialist sympathetic to Kenyatta's plight, released The Trial of Jomo Kenyatta, a book which raised the profile of the case. In 1958, Rawson Macharia, the key witness in the state's prosecution of Kenyatta, signed an affidavit swearing that his evidence against Jomo Kenyatta had been false, and this too was widely publicized. By the late 1950s, the imprisoned Jomo Kenyatta had become a symbol of African nationalism across the continent. His sentence fully served, in April 1959, Jomo Kenyatta was released from Rocky Town. The administration then placed a restricting order on Jomo Kenyatta, forcing him to reside in the remote area of Lodwar, where he had to report to the district commissioner twice a day. There, he was joined by his wife Ngina. In October 1961, they had another son, Uhuru, and later another daughter, Nyokafi, and further a son, Mohoho. Kenyatta spent 2 years in Lodwar. The governor of Kenya colony, Patrick Maya Renson, insisted that this was necessary. In a March 1961 speech, he described Kenyatta as an African leader to darkness and death and stated that if he were released, violence would erupt. This indefinite detention was widely interpreted internationally as a reflection of the cruelties of British imperialism. Calls for his release came from the Chinese government, India's Nehru, and Tanganyika's Prime Minister Julius Nyerere. Kwame Nkrumah, whom Kenyatta had known since the 1940s and who was now president of a newly independent Ghana, personally raised the issue with British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and other UK officials, with the Ghanaian government offering Kenyatta asylum in the event of his release. Resolutions calling for his release were produced at the All-African People's Conference held in Tunis, Tunisia in 1960 and in Cairo in 1961. Internal calls for his release came from the Kenya Asian activists in the Kenya Indian Congress, while a colonial government-commissioned poll revealed that most of Kenya's indigenous Africans wanted this outcome. By this point, it was widely accepted that Kenyan independence was inevitable, the British Empire having been dismantled throughout much of Asia and Macmillan having made his wind of change speech. In January 1960, the British government made its intentions to make Kenya free apparent. It invited representatives of Kenya's anti-colonial movement to discuss the transition at London's Lancaster House. An agreement was reached that an election would be called for a new 65-seat legislative council with 33 seats reserved for black Africans, 24 other ethnic groups, and 12 as national members elected by a pan-racial electorate. It was clear to all concerned that Kenyatta was going to be the key to the future of Kenyan politics. After the Lancaster House negotiations, the anti-colonial movement had split into two parties, the Kenya African National Union KANU, which was dominated by Kikuyu and Luo, and the Kenya African Democratic Union KADU, which was led largely by members of smaller ethnic groups like the Kalenjin and Maasai. In May 1960, KANU nominated Kenyatta as its president, although the government vetoed it, insisting that he had been an instigator of Mau Mau. KANU then declared that it would refuse to take part in any government unless Kenyatta was freed. KANU campaigned on the issue of Kenyatta's detainment in the February 1961 election, where it gained a majority of votes. KANU, nevertheless, refused to form a government, which was instead created through a KADU-led coalition of smaller parties. Kenyatta was kept abreast of these developments, although he had refused to back either KANU or KADU, instead insisting on unity between the two parties. Governor Renison decided to release Jomo Kenyatta before Kenya achieved independence. He thought public exposure to Kenyatta prior to elections would make the populace less likely to vote for a man Renison regarded as a violent extremist. He In April 1961, the government flew Kenyatta to Maralal, where he maintained his innocence of the charges but told reporters that he bore no grudges. He reiterated that he had never supported violence or the illegal oathing system used by the Mau Mau. He denied having ever been a Marxist, stating, quote, "I shall always remain an African nationalist to the end of quote. In August, Kenyatta was moved to Gatondo in Kikuyu-land, where he was greeted by a crowd of 10,000 people. There, the colonial government had built him a new house to replace the one they had demolished when they arrested him in the early 50s. Now a free man, Kenyatta traveled to cities like Nairobi and Mombasa to make public appearances. After his release, Kenyatta set about to ensure that he was the only realistic option as Kenya's future leader. In August, he met with Venison at Kiambu, and he was interviewed by the BBC's face-to-face program. In October 1961, Kenyatta formally joined KANU and accepted its presidency. In January 1962, he was elected unopposed as KANU's representative for the Fort Hall constituency in the Legislative Council after its sitting member, Kariuki Njiri, resigned. Jomo Kenyatta traveled elsewhere in Africa, visiting Tanganyika in October 1961 and Ethiopia in November at the invitation of their government. A key issue facing Kenya was a border dispute in northeastern province alongside the border with Somalia. Ethnic Somalis inhabited this region and claimed it should be part of Somalia, not Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta disagreed, insisting the land remain in Kenya, and stated that Somalis in Kenya should pack up their camels and go to Somalia. In June 1962, Jomo Kenyatta traveled to Mogadishu to discuss the issue with the Somalian authorities, but the two sides could not reach an agreement. Just before independence, Jomo Kenyatta sought to gain the confidence of the white settler community. In 1962, the white minority had produced 80% of the country's exports and were a vital part of the economy, yet between 1962 and 1963, they were emigrating from Kenya at a rate of 700 a month, and Jomo Kenyatta, the new leader, feared that this white exodus would cause a brain drain and a skill shortage that would be detrimental to the new economy. He was also aware that the confidence of the white minority would be crucial to securing Western investment in Kenya's economy. Jomo Kenyatta made it clear that when in power, he would not sack any white civil servants unless there were competent black individuals capable of replacing them. He was then sufficiently successful that several prominent white Kenyans backed KANU in the subsequent elections. In 1962, Kenyatta returned to London to attend one of the Lancaster House conferences. There, KANU and KADU representatives met with the British officials to formulate a new constitution. KADU desired a federalist state organized on a system they called Majimbo, with 6 autonomous regional authorities, a 2-chamber legislature, and a central federal council of ministers who would select a rotating chair to serve as head of government for a 1-year term. Renaissance administration and most white settlers favored this system as it would prevent a strong central government implementing radical reforms. KANU opposed Majimbo, believing that it served entrenched interest and denied equal opportunities across Kenya, and they also insisted on an elected head of government. At Kenyatta's prompting, KANU conceded to some of KADU's demands because he was aware that he could amend the constitution when in office as head of government. The new constitution divided Kenya into 6 regions, each with a regional assembly, but also featured a strong central government and both an upper and a lower house. It was agreed that a contemporary coalition government would be established until independence, several KANU politicians being given ministerial positions in this coalition government. Jomo Kenyatta accepted a minor position, that of the Minister of State for Constitutional Affairs and Economic Planning. The British government considered Renaissance as too ill at ease with indigenous Africans to oversee the transition to independence, and thus replaced him with Malcolm MacDonald as governor of Kenya in January 1963. MacDonald and Kenyatta developed a strong friendship, the Briton referring to the latter as the wisest, perhaps strongest, as well as most popular potential prime minister of the independent nation to be. MacDonald sped up plans for Kenyan independence, believing that the longer they wait, the greater the opportunity for radicalization among African nationalists. An election was scheduled for May, with self-government in June, followed by full independence in December 1964. The May 1963 general elections pitted Kenyatta's KANU party against KADU, the Akamba People's Party, and various independent candidates. KANU was victorious with 83 seats out of 124 in the House of Representatives. A KANU majority government replaced the pre-existing coalition. On the 1st of June 1963, Jomo Kenyatta was sworn in as Prime Minister of the autonomous Kenya government. Kenya remained a monarchy with Queen Elizabeth II as the head of state. In November 1963, Kenyatta's government introduced a law making it a criminal offense to disrespect the Prime Minister, exile being the main punishment. Kenyatta's personality became a central aspect of the creation of the new state. In December, Nairobi Delamere Avenue was renamed Kenyatta Avenue, and a bronze statue of him was erected beside the country's National Assembly. Photographs of Kenyatta were widely displayed in shop windows, and his face was also printed on the new currency. In 1964, Oxford University Press published a collection of Kenyatta's speeches under the title Harambee. Kenyatta's first cabinet included not only Kikuyu but also members of the Luo, Kamba, Kisii, and Maragoli tribes. In June 1963, Jomo Kenyatta met Julius Nyerere and Ugandan President Milton Obote in Nairobi. The trio discussed the possibility of merging the three nations plus Zanzibar into a single East African federation, agreeing that this would be accomplished by the end of the year. Privately, Kenyatta was more reluctant regarding the arrangement, and as 1964 came around, the federation had not come to pass. Many radical voices in Kenya urged him to pursue the project, and in May 1964, Kenyatta rejected a backbenchers resolution calling for a speedier federation. He publicly stated that talk of a federation had always been a ruse to hasten the pace of Kenyan independence from Britain, but Nyerere denied that was true. Continuing to emphasize good relations with the white settlers, in August 1963, Kenyatta met with 300 white farmers in Nakuru. He reassured them that they would be safe and welcome in an independent Kenya, and more broadly talked of forgiving and forgetting the conflicts of the past. Despite his attempts at wooing white settlers, Kenyatta did not do the same with the Indian minority. Like many indigenous Africans in Kenya, Kenyatta bore a sense of resentment towards the community, despite the role that some Indians had played in securing the country's independence. He also encouraged the remaining Mau Mau fighters to leave the forest and settle in a society. Throughout Kenyatta's rule, many of these individuals remained out of work, unemployed, with unemployment being one of the most persistent problems facing his government. A celebration to mark independence was held in a specially constructed stadium on the 12th of December 1963. During the ceremony, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, representing the British monarchy, formally handed over control of Kenya to Kenyatta. Also in attendance were leading figures from Mau Mau. In a speech, Kenyatta described it as a great day in Kenya's history and the happiest day in my life. He had flown Edna and Peter over for the ceremony, and in Kenya they were welcomed into Kenyatta's family by his other wives. Disputes with Somalia over the northern frontier district continued. For much of Kenyatta's rule, Somalia remained the major threat to his government. To deal with sporadic violence in the region by Somalia shifter guerrillas, Kenyatta sent soldiers into the region in December 1963 and gave them broader powers of arrest and seizure inside the Northern Frontier District (NFD) in September 1964. British troops were assigned to assist the Kenyan army in the region. Kenyatta also faced domestic opposition because in January 1964, sections of the army launched a mutiny in Nairobi, and Kenyatta called on the British army to put down the rebellion. Similar armed uprisings had taken place that month in neighboring Uganda and Tanganyika. Jomo Kenyatta was reported to be outraged and shaken by this mutiny. He publicly rebuked the mutineers, emphasizing the need for law and order in Kenya. To prevent further military unrest, Kenyatta brought in a review of salaries of the army, police, and prison staff, leading to pay rises. Kenyatta also wanted to contain parliamentary opposition, and at his prompting, in November 1964, KADU was officially dissolved and its representatives joined KANU. Two of the senior members of KADU, Ronald Ngala and Daniel Moi, subsequently became some of Kenyatta's most loyal supporters. Kenya therefore became a de facto one-party state. In December 1964, Kenya was officially proclaimed a republic. Jomo Kenyatta became its executive president, combining the roles of head state and head of government, and over the course of 1965 and 1966, several constitutional amendments enhanced the president's power. For instance, a May 1966 amendment gave the president the ability to order the preventive detention of individuals without trial if he deemed them to be security risks. Seeking the support of Kenya's second largest ethnic group, the Luo, Kenyatta appointed the Luo Oginga Odinga as his vice president. The Kikuyu, who made up around 20% of the population, still had most of the country's important government and administrative positions. This contributed to a long-running perception among many Kenyans that independence had simply seen the dominance of a British elite replaced by the dominance of a Kikuyu elite. Jomo Kenyatta's calls to forgive and forget the past were the keystone of his government. He preserved some elements of old colonial order, particularly in relation to law and order. The police and military structures were left largely intact. White Kenyans were left in senior positions within the judiciary, civil service, and parliament, with examples of white Kenyans such as Bruce Mackenzie and Humphrey Slade being among Kenyatta's top officials in government. Kenyatta's government nevertheless rejected the idea that the European and Asian minorities could be permitted dual citizenship, expecting those communities to offer total loyalty to the independent Kenyan state. His administration pressured whites-only social clubs to adopt multiracial entry policies, and in 1964, schools formerly reserved for European peoples were opened to Africans and Asians. Kenyatta's government believed it necessary to cultivate a united Kenya national culture, and to this end, it made efforts to assert the dignity of indigenous African cultures which missionaries and colonial authorities had belittled as primitive. An East African Literature Bureau was created to publish the work for indigenous writers. The Kenya Culture Center supported indigenous art and music, and hundreds of traditional music and dance groups were formed, Kenyatta personally insisting that such performances were held at all national celebrations. Support was given to the preservation of all historic and cultural monuments, while street names referencing colonial figures were renamed and symbols of colonialism like the statue of British settler Hugh Shomontley, 3rd Baron de la Mare in Nairobi City Center, were removed. The government encouraged the use of Swahili as the national language, although English remained the main medium for parliamentary debates and language of instruction in schools and universities. The historian Robert M. Maxson, nevertheless, suggested that no national culture emerged during the Kenyatta era, more statistic and cultural expression reflecting particular ethnic groups rather than a broader sense of Kenyanness, while Western culture remained heavily influential over the country's elites. Under Jomo Kenyatta, the question of land ownership had deep-running emotional resonance amongst Kenyans, especially those of Mount Kenya, and as part of the Lancaster House negotiations, Britain's government had agreed to provide Kenya with £27 million on which to buy out white farmers and to redistribute their land among the indigenous African population. To ease this transition, Kenyatta made Bruce Mackenzie, a white farmer, the Minister of Agriculture and Land. Kenyatta's government encouraged the establishment of private land buying companies that were often headed by prominent politicians. The government sold or leased lands in the former White Highlands to these companies, which in turn subdivided them among individual shareholders. In this way, the land redistribution programs favored the ruling party's chief constituency. Kenyatta himself expanded the land that he owned around Gatundu. Kenyans who made claims to land on the basis of ancestral ownership often found the land given to other people, including Kenyans from different parts of the country. Voices began to condemn the redistribution, and in 1969, the MP Jean-Marie Seroney censored the sale of historically Nandi lands in the Rift Valley to non-Nandi people, describing the settlement scheme as Kenyatta's colonization of the Rift Valley. In part fueled by high rural unemployment, Kenya witnessed a growing rural to urban migration under Jomo Kenyatta's government. The exaggerated urban unemployment and housing shortages, with squatter settlements and slums shooting up around the city and urban crimes rising. Kenyatta was concerned by this and promoted the reversal of this rural to urban migration, but it was not very successful. Kenyatta's government was eager to control the country's trade unions, fearing their ability to disrupt the economy. To this end, his government emphasized social welfare schemes over traditional industry institutions, and in 1965, it transformed the Kenya Federation of Labor into the central organization of trade unions, KOTU, a body which came under strong government influence. No strikes could be legally carried out in Kenya without KOTU's permission. There were also measures to Africanize the civil service, which by the middle of 1967 had become 91% African. During the 1960s and 1970s, the public sector grew faster than the private sector. The growth of the public sector contributed to the significant expansion of the indigenous middle class in Kenyatta's Kenya. Under Kenyatta, the government oversaw a massive expansion in education facilities. In June 1963, Kenyatta ordered the Ominda Commission to determine a framework for meeting Kenya's educational needs. The Ominda Commission's report set out the long-term goal of universal free primary education in Kenya, but argued that the government's emphasis should be on secondary and higher education to facilitate the training of indigenous African personnel to take over the civil service and other jobs requiring such an education. Between 1964 and 1966, the number of primary schools grew by 11.6% in Kenya, and the number of secondary schools grew by 80%. By the time of Mzee Jomo Kenyatta's death, Kenya's first universities, the University of Nairobi and Kenyatta University, had been established. Although Kenyatta died without having attained the goal of free, universal primary education in Kenya, the country had made significant advances in that direction, with 85% of Kenyan children in primary education, and within a decade of independence, the country had trained sufficient numbers of indigenous Africans to take over the civil service. Another priority for Kenyatta's government was improving access to healthcare services. Jomo Kenyatta's government stated that its long-term goal was to establish a system of free, universal medical care. In the short term, the administration's emphasis was on increasing overall numbers of doctors and registered nurses while decreasing the number of expatriates in those positions. In 1965, the government introduced free medical services for outpatients and children. By Kenyatta's death, the majority of Kenyans had access to significantly better healthcare than they had under the colonial rule. Before independence, the average life expectancy in Kenya, that is the age at which most adults died, was 45, but by the end of 1970s, it was 55, the second highest in sub-Saharan Africa. This improved medical care had resulted in declining mortality rate, while birth rates remained high, resulting in a rapidly growing population, and from 1962 to 1979 grew by 4% a year, the highest rate in the world at the time. This put a severe strain on social services, and Kenyatta's government promoted family planning projects to stem the birth rate, but this had little success. In part due to his advanced years, because Kenyatta was already 66 years at the time of independence, the president rarely traveled outside East Africa, and under Kenyatta, Kenya was mostly uninvolved in the affairs of other states, including those in the East African community. Despite his reservations about any immediate East African federation, in June 1967, Jomo Kenyatta signed the Treaty of East African Cooperation. In December, he attended a meeting with Tanzanian and Ugandan representatives to form the East African Economic Community, reflecting Kenyatta's cautious approach toward regional integration. He also took on a mediating role during the Congo crisis, heading the Organization of Africa Union's Conciliation Commission on the Congo. Facing the pressures of the Cold War, Jomo Kenyatta officially pursued a policy of positive non-alignment, meaning he would not take any sides in the war between the Russians and the Americans. In reality, his foreign policy was pro-Western and in particular pro-British. Kenya became a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, and using this as a vehicle to put pressure on the white minority apartheid regimes in South Africa and Rhodesia, Kenyatta became a central voice in the group of leaders who were leading the newly decolonized Africa. Britain remained one of Kenya's foremost sources of foreign trade, and British aid to Kenya was among the highest in Africa. In 1964, Kenya and the UK signed a Memorandum of Understanding, one of only 2 military alliances Kenyatta's government ever made. The British Special Air Service trained Kenyatta's own bodyguards. Commentators argued that Britain's relationship with Kenyatta was a new colonial one, with the British having exchanged their position of political power for one of influence. Jomo Kenyatta made clear his desire for Kenya to become a one-party state, regarding this as a better expression of national unity than a multi-party system. In the first 5 years of independence, he consolidated control of the central government, removing the autonomy of Kenya's provinces or majimbo to prevent the entrenchment of ethnic power bases. Kenyatta argued that centralized control of the government was needed to deal with the growth in demand for local services and to assist quick economic development. In 1966, Kenyatta launched a commission to examine reforms to local government operations, and in 1969, he passed the Transfer of Functions Act, which terminated financial grants to local authorities and transferred major services from provincial to central control. For many years, Jomo Kenyatta had suffered health problems. He had a mild stroke in 1966 and a second one in May 1968. He suffered from gout and heart problems, all of which he sought to keep hidden from the public. By the year 1970, Kenyatta was increasingly feeble and senile, and by 1975, Kenyatta had, according to an historian known as Maloba, in effect ceased to actively govern. 4 Kikuyu politicians, Koinange, James Gishuru, Njoroge Mungai, and Charles Njonjo, formed his inner circle of associates, and he was rarely seen in public without one of them present. This clique faced opposition from Kano backbenchers, spearheaded by Josiah Mwangi Kariuki, J.M. Kariuki. In March 1975, Kariuki was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, and his body was dumped in Ngong Hills. After Kariuki's murder, Maloba noted that there was a noticeable erosion of support for Kenyatta and his government. From there, when the president spoke to crowds, they no longer applauded his statements. In 1977, Jomo Kenyatta had several strokes or heart attacks. On 22nd August 1978, he died of a heart attack in the State House, Mombasa. The Kenyan government had been preparing for Kenyatta's death since at least his 1968 stroke, and it had requested British assistance in organizing a state funeral as a result of the United Kingdom's long-standing experience in the area. Bruce Mackenzie, the white minister in Kenyatta's government, who was also known to be a British spy in Kenyatta's government, was employed as a go-between, and the structure of Jomo Kenyatta's 1978 funeral was orchestrated to imitate that of the deceased Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In doing so, senior Kenyans sought to project an image of their country as a modern nation-state rather than one incumbent on tradition. The funeral took place at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church only 6 days after Jomo Kenyatta's death. Britain's heir to the throne, King Charles, then Prince of Wales, attended the event, a symbol of the value that the British government perceived in its relationship with Kenya. African heads of state also attended, including Nyerere, Idi Amin, Kenneth Kaunda, and Hastings Banda, as did India's Morarji Desai and Pakistan's Mohammed Zia-ul-Haq. Kenyatta's body was buried in the grounds of the parliament buildings in Nairobi. Mzee Jomo Kenyatta's succession had been an issue of debate since independence, and Kenyatta had not nominated a successor. The Kikuyu clique surrounding him had sought to amend the constitution to prevent Vice President Daniel Moi, who was from the Kalenjin people rather than the Kikuyu, from automatically becoming acting president, but their attempts failed and attracted popular national and parliamentary opposition. After Kenyatta's death, the transition of power proved smooth, surprising many international commentators. As vice president, Moi was sworn in as acting president for a 90-day interim period. In October, he was unanimously elected Kano president and subsequently declared president of Kenya itself. Moi emphasized his loyalty to Kenyatta, saying, I quote, "I followed and was faithful to him until his last day, even when his closest friends forsook him," end of quote. And there were much expectation that he would continue the policies inaugurated by Kenyatta. In 1982, Moi would amend the Kenyan constitution to create a de jure one-party state.